It's now live, Bento Bureau.
Itadakimasu!
So just before we start the episode today, we'd just like to inform the viewers that today's episode had a few technical difficulties due to the unstable line. I'm the host Buzz, and today with me is Long and Jess.
Hi guys, it's Jess again, co-starring for today's episode about Amnesty International Japan.
And I'm Long. Usually I'll be your audio guy, but today I'll be talking. And before we start our show, we'd like to announce that Bastian and Ichi are pursuing graduate degree in the UK at the moment.
Yeah, so they're not going to be regular members on the show anymore, I'm afraid. Please don't unsubscribe to us if you were big fans of Ichi and
Particularly Bastian.
I know Bastian's a popular guy, but please, we will find a suitable candidate to replace them. No, not really. Stick around. We have a lot of good content this semester. We're planning to really ramp up the chain of content. So please stick around and enjoy this episode. So welcome back to Bento Bureau, the show where we talk about Japan from an international perspective with a side dish of socio-political discussion. With us today are two very special guests coming from Amnesty International in Japan, Chris Pitts and Marian Hara. Please introduce yourselves.
Okay, well, we are members of ITAN. So ITAN is one of the groups within Amnesty International Japan, and it stands for Amnesty International Tokyo English Network. And we have regular meetings. We get involved with some fundraising, film shows, many kinds of events. And we meet every month. And so we'd be very happy if some people would like to come and join us after you hear what we're doing. I come from Scotland, and I've lived in Japan for a very long time. I've been involved with I-10 and Amnesty for about coming up for 10 years, perhaps.
Good, thank you, Marian. My name is Chris Pitts, and I'd like to stress that I'm not an employee of Amnesty International Japan. I'm a volunteer, like Marian, like so many people. I've been active and involved with Amnesty International Japan for nearly 20 years.
Okay, thank you for that. So I just want to start with a question for a personal note for both of you. So what motivated you to join such an organization for human rights such as Amnesty in the first place?
When I was living and working in the UK, where I was born and grew up, I was quite active politically, mostly single issue campaigns, for example, to stop cruise missiles. I was active in my trade union. I took a great interest in politics. And when I came to Japan to work, suddenly all of those activities were closed off to me because of the language barrier. A friend of mine suggested finding a group of Amnesty International that I might work with, which I did. There was an English-speaking group in Tokyo. I joined them, and I've been very happy to be active with them ever since. It's one thing that really strikes me looking back over the years is how many like-minded people I have met through Amnesty International membership and activity, and I've been very grateful for that suggestion.
Well, before I came to Japan, being British, of course I knew about Amnesty International, but I honestly didn't know that much. And it was a suggestion of a friend who had been active with I-10. He said, you should come and get involved. And so I went to a film show, and then I went to a meeting. And, you know, when you look at the issues that Amnesty is dealing with, in particular, people who are being slammed into prison by their governments for merely expressing their opinion in many cases, it's something that just strikes a very deep chord, that people should not suffer at the hands of their governments, that we should have the right to speak out and say what we think and to take action in a democratic way in any society. So I think it's just a very deep sense of something that we should all be supporting. Absolutely. Yes.
I have said in public on several occasions that you can guarantee your government will collect taxes from you. You cannot guarantee that your government will protect your human rights. We need to get together. We need to organize. We need to make sure that our human rights are defended and are protected by organizing ourselves, especially those of us in countries where we enjoy a large amount of protection, we enjoy a large amount of freedom. It's our responsibility to help others enjoy the same rights and the same freedom. And what I'm talking about is not abstract. All these rights, all these freedoms are written down and codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations document that was drafted and signed in 1948. It's an awfully long time ago. It's been ratified by most of the countries around the world since then. And we're not interfering with foreign governments and foreign politics by encouraging or urging foreign governments to defend human rights. They've already committed themselves to doing it by ratifying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All we are doing is asking for them to do what they have already promised to do. So when Turkey, for example, jails journalists, that is in contravention of their own commitments on the international stage. We're simply reminding them of what they have already promised to do, to defend freedom of speech and not to jail journalists for telling the truth. I pick out Turkey, it's just because I want to keep my remarks brief, but all countries at some time or other are in contravention of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. Is something that most countries around the world have signed up to. And by urging them to release a particular journalist or to stop a particular course of action or to allow, for example, women to drive without a male escort, we are simply urging them to observe their own treaty obligations on the international stage.
I would add that in Japan, there's a sense that in Japan people assume that their human rights are all well protected by their government. And so living in Japan also, it makes one very aware that this is something you cannot take for granted. People, I find many people in Japan assume that life is wonderful here for everyone and that we're all well protected. And in fact, that's not true. So, of course, in Amnesty International's work, we are often looking at other countries. And there are good reasons for that, because in many countries, it's very, very hard for people to take this kind of action against their own governments. So putting pressure through letter writing and other kinds of appeals to foreign governments is a very strong way of achieving the aims of having people released from prison and so on. So for me personally, somehow living in Japan makes this even more important. In the UK, there are many amnesty groups all over the country, and they're very, very active. But in Japan, it's a very small organization, and sometimes it's a struggle to reach people and to get people's interest, because there is sometimes a fear of being political. Would you agree, Chris?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. The reasons that Amnesty International is perhaps not as well known and not as well supported here in Japan as in many other countries is partly historical, it's partly social, and it's partly language. For example, there isn't a Japanese word that means amnesty. There isn't an exact or easy translation. And so the organization uses the English word in katakana, Amnesty International. That in itself is a little bit of an obstacle to understanding the tradition of collective action so much here to defend people's interests against the government, against powerful forces as maybe there is in other places. France springs to mind with its very strong revolutionary tradition. But we do, as individuals, enjoy a large amount of freedom here in Japan, and it's perfectly feasible for anyone who lives and works here to legally to get involved without any personal risk at all. And I'm talking about not only students, people from overseas, but also Japanese citizens. And I tend, although we are an English-speaking group, we have a proportion, maybe 10% or so, of our members are Japanese people who choose to work with us and choose to be active in English. And all of us enjoy doing the activity without any fear for ourselves or our safety. In fact, we enjoy collectively meeting together and exercising, feeling our own power and exercising our own rights. Human rights, it's said, are like muscles. The more you exercise them, the stronger they get. If you don't use them, they will atrophy. And so if you've got these freedoms, if you've got the right to protest, use it by all means. If there's something that you don't like about the society that you're in or the world, make it your business to speak out and to try and change it. It's as simple as that.
I have a question for Miriam. You mentioned that in Japan, some people are not aware that there are some human rights violations. You stated that most people feel that their human rights are protected in Japan. What are some issues in Japan in particular where the human rights are considered being violated?
Well, there are issues around the justice system, for a start, in my view. Japan has the death penalty, and there have been many cases of wrongful arrest, wrongful imprisonment, in many cases for decades. So there is a huge issue going back of how far the police and the prosecution system in Japan can be trusted to follow the rules. And we know many cases. There's a very famous case of Mr. Hakamada Iwao was in prison for 48 years for a murder which he didn't commit. And in fact, the police were found to have fabricated false evidence in order to have him arrested, tried, and given the death penalty. So there is a tendency for people to assume that the police do everything in the most honorable way, and in fact they don't. And you can see this at another level. Recently, we've heard quite a lot of cases of black guys being stopped at random on the streets and being asked to open their bags to submit to a search, although there is, in fact, they should not by law be required to do so. And in fact, one person recently tried to take a court case against the police. His case was dismissed. And these are issues coming up to the Olympics. It seems that there's going to be quite possibly a lot of human rights abuse, in the sense that the police, in their eagerness to keep Japan safe, may be overstepping the mark. So there are other issues. Perhaps Chris can add some more.
I think it's worth noting that Amnesty International, as an organization, opposes the death penalty in all cases. And that is an aim for us in Japan, where to work towards, to win acceptance of the idea that nobody should be executed for any crime whatsoever. We want to live in a society that consistently opposes killing and not selectively opposes killing. And that might be a difficult concept for some people to grasp. And in the meantime, though, we will be continuing to stress, as Marian talked about, the miscarriages of justice that are very common in Japan because of the over-enthusiasm, shall we say, of the police, the prosecutors, and the legal system to tie up loose ends and to match people, to pay the price for crimes, even sometimes if it's not the right people. She mentioned a famous case of Mr. Hakamada, and there have been several others that we know about, and several others that we suspect. So opposition to the death penalty, yes, is a big one for us, and particularly important in Japan. So it's an argument that we continually trying to win with more and more people.
If I remember correctly, Japan recently voted against the UN resolution that opposed the death penalty, along with the US and some other states as well. And also, talking about the police checks, I think is very relevant to us international students. A lot of us are first-time foreigners coming to Japan, not having the language skills. So when we have a policeman approach us, usually we are often afraid and just go do what he told us to do. And a lot of time we don't know if it's within their right or do we have a right to refuse or not. But I think it's something that foreigners are very vulnerable to.
Can I ask you there, because you mentioned being stopped yourself, has that happened to you?
I think I have not had that experience, but that's something that I've heard from my friends.
Yes.
I have once. I was riding my bike to the station to go to school, and then the policeman just stopped me because the bike that I was riding fit a certain description of a bike that was reported stolen. So
that's what they always say.
Yeah. And then they asked me to get off, and then they asked me who the owner was, and then I told them it was bought under my mother's name, and it kind of just took 5-10 minutes out of my life, but nonetheless it was quite an annoyance.
Yes, I've heard stories. Actually, Chris once saw the same thing happening to some young Japanese people. I remember him telling the story of some young people in Shibuya who were probably suspected of drugs. It's usually that they're looking for drugs, and they should not demand that you open your bag unless they're taking you in for questioning. But what they tend to do is to surround the person so that you have very few other options. And if you're in a hurry to go to work, then you're really stuck there. Because if you try to push past a policeman, they can then arrest you for interfering with them in the course of their duties. So it's a tough situation for many people.
This whole area of civil liberties in Japan, what are your rights as a person walking down the street? Something that Amnesty International does not deal with directly. However, it is something that everyone should know about. And I would strongly recommend that you contact one of the people who is an expert in civil, English-speaking expert in civil liberties, like Professor Arudo Debito, who now currently lives and works in Hawaii, but is a Japanese citizen, lived here, and has just written a fascinating book about racism in Japan called Embedded Racism. And he would be happy, I'm sure, to do a podcast interview with you to explain to everybody what their rights are as residents of Japan. Whether you're a citizen or not, whether you have whatever passport you've got, you do have rights. The police should obey the law when they're questioning you and when they're dealing with you. And he's the expert to talk to on that.
Moving on, I would like to ask, what are some of the ways that Amnesty promotes its message to the Japanese public as foreigners living in Japan? Like, what sort of influence do you have in that regard in changing the Japanese political and social spectrum?
Perhaps I'd start by clarifying the fact that it's not one of our aims to change the Japanese political spectrum. Amnesty International insists quite rightly that it's a non-political organization. What we do is to defend the human rights of individuals and groups around the world. Most of the activity that we undertake is directed at foreign governments and at cases of prisoners of conscience overseas. I'll just take a bit of a sidebar here, to explain a prisoner of conscience. According to Amnesty International, a prisoner of conscience is someone who has been put in prison because of their views or because of their sexuality, and someone who perhaps has said or done something that has displeased their government, but someone who has never advocated or used violence to try and achieve their ends. And so, interestingly, perhaps one of the world's most famous prisoners of conscience, Nelson Mandela, was never adopted officially as an Amnesty International prisoner of conscience because he was the director of the armed wing of the African National Congress, Mkhonto we Sizwe, when he was active before he was put in prison. However, there are plenty of people around the world, bloggers in Saudi Arabia, for example, women who've been campaigning for their rights, journalists who've upset their government by revealing things their government would rather not have been revealed, like our adopted prisoner of conscience, Mr. Eskinder Nega in Ethiopia, sentenced to 18 years in prison for writing about the use of torture by police interrogators in his country. Those kinds of issues are the ones that we take up, and we do so by writing letters to the government concerned, perhaps to the prison governor concerned, where we know there might be a health issue, for example, the prisoners being denied access to medicine or medical treatment. We might write to the prisoner themselves or to their families so that they know people out abroad, people outside their country, know of the case and are supporting them. And that, just for a prisoner to know that somebody outside the country, somebody somewhere cares about their case, can be the thing that keeps them sane and keeps them alive while they're in prison. It's statistics that Amnesty International has collected show that we get a positive result in about 70 to 75% of the cases that we take up. And from that point of view, I feel that Amnesty International activity is never a waste of time. You never know exactly what the outcome will be, but you do know that it's likely to be a positive outcome.
May I introduce something? If you're a member of Amnesty International and an English speaker, you will get this magazine, which comes out several times a year, called The Wire. And every month they have success stories here. For example, headlines: you took 4.6 million actions. So, people keep a tab of how many letters go, how many messages are sent. Many of them are online, but a lot of people also write actual physical letters which will land on someone's desk. And this is very important, we think. A click is a click, but a desk, a letter on a desk is something physical that has to be dealt with. Another headline: death sentence commuted, prisoner released. In Taiwan, yes to marriage equality. Peace activist says thank you, cartoonist compensated. So thankfully, the actions that people are taking do see these kind of results. And so I think this is what keeps people going. It's good to be part of something that is making some change somewhere.
Talking about the I-10 network, I'm curious, how did Amnesty come to Japan? From what my information has been around for more than 20 years. And Chris, you have been with I-10 for a long time, and Marian as well.
Well, Amnesty International was set up in the UK in 1961. And about 10 years later, some people in Japan decided to establish a national branch here in this country. And I think that the Japanese group was established in 1970 or so. Now, since then, various people who support Amnesty have come to live and work in Japan, and some of them have come together around I-10. Some of us are maybe were members before in their home country, like Canada, Australia, or United States, or European countries. We have members from France, from Italy, from Latin American countries. Some of those people maybe joined or became active with Amnesty International for the first time after they came to Japan. It's very varied and everybody has their own story.
What is the most recent issue that I-10 has been focusing on as of late throughout their meetings? What have you been working towards lately?
We had quite a lot of focus on LGBTQ issues. There was a big problem in Chechen, and this year AIJ took part in the gay parade, which was wonderful, the Rainbow Parade before the summer. That's one big issue. It's ongoing for us to focus on the arrest of journalists. And Chris mentioned the Ethiopian journalists who we support. We continue regularly to write letters on behalf of Eskinder Nega. He should not be in prison, and we will continue our efforts to have him released.
I searched the Amnesty International Japan's website, and one of the topics that was on the page was regarding refugees and asylum seekers in Japan. Could you give us a little more information about how Amnesty International Japan is tackling the issue of refugees in Japan?
Yeah, briefly, I think that it's just enough to say that Amnesty International Japan is trying to win the confidence of more and more people about welcoming refugees into Japan. The government apparently believes that this is a vote loser, and successive governments over the last 20 years, as the refugee crisis has grown, have been highly resistant to accepting asylum seekers and refugees into Japan. I think Amnesty Japan is trying to point out the reality that they have an aging population, a shrinking workforce, a falling birth rate, a falling population, and Japan needs young people. Accepting refugees is not only an act of charity towards that person who's fleeing persecution and fleeing a war zone, it's actually a step that will help Japan in the future. And by advancing that argument, I think that AI Japan is making a contribution and trying to persuade people to open their arms and open Japan a little more to accepting refugees.
On issues like refugees, AIJ works together with many other groups. And some groups are very much on the ground giving individual support to individual people. On the whole, Amnesty's role has been to collect information which supports cases in general from different countries, because refugees applying to be accepted into Japan need to prove that they have been directly threatened. And the barrier is very, very high. So in concert with other groups, they are trying to change the rules, but their big contribution of Amnesty in general, Amnesty International Japan, has been to document what's happening in different countries to give support to people's applications. But as you have probably heard, this year, in the first half of this year, only 3 people have been accepted as refugees, which is unbelievably low. So it's obviously an ongoing situation that Amnesty will not give up on.
I'm also curious, in Japan in particular, what are some projects that Amnesty International is undergoing at the moment?
Right at the moment, there's a big lectures tour coming up with now. I think Chris will have more to say on this, but a Chinese activist, Chen, who was able to escape amazingly and went to the US, is now coming to Japan to give a lecture tour. He's a blind lawyer, and he was supporting women who had been forced to have abortions. Chris, can you explain some more about Chen?
Well, you've asked us about events that are coming up in Tokyo and in Japan in the near future. One of the things that's happening in the very near future, Amnesty International Japan has invited a blind Chinese human rights lawyer, Chen Guangcheng, who spectacularly, despite being blind and despite being on his own, escaped from house arrest and made his way to the American embassy in Beijing, where he given asylum, and now he is living and working in the United States. Amnesty International Japan has invited him on a speaking tour, and on this month, October the 29th, 2017, Sunday in the afternoon, Chen Guangcheng will speak in Tokyo, and you can get more details from the Amnesty International Japan website. ITEN itself also organizes educational events and fundraising events. Our next event is a fundraising event. It's stand-up comedy night at a pub called Good Heavens in Shimokitazawa, Tokyo. For 1,500 yen, you get in, you get a free drink, and you get an evening of comedy from a variety of stand-up comedians. Please come and support that event.
Could you maybe explain to the viewers how can they get more involved in Amnesty International?
There are, people respond and take part at different levels. Some people are very, very busy and they support us, but perhaps they're not going to come regularly to meetings. So coming along to any of the fundraising events or lecture tours is one thing that's very important. We welcome people who want to come and spend, a time together every month. If that's not possible, there are many things you can do. You can, of course, go online, and there are many, many appeals that are on the online website where you can just click and, add your name to the names of many others. But if you have the time and the interest to come along, then coming to a meeting and sharing your gifts, because there are people who have different skills, filming, organizing events. We've had a whole range of events which depend on the people who are there. We've had afternoon tea events and lunchtime events where somebody speaks and we raise money while talking about human rights. We have music events. So if you have time and you like organizing get-togethers where people are having fun but they're also supporting something, then there's a lot of potential there. We will be very welcoming of anyone with their ideas. For example, when Chen was before Mr. Chen was released, we had a fundraiser in a pub in Ebisu with it was a dance event, a music event, and we sold sunglasses to all the people who came. So the place was full of people wearing sunglasses, kind of supporting Jen by showing their solidarity with him, and we raised a lot of money, which helped to continue the work, so that, for example, AIJ is able to bring in people like Jen to come and talk to us about their actions.
Just to add on to that about Amnesty communities, setting them up. So in our university, we actually attempted to set up our very own community for Amnesty, but unfortunately it fell through because the administration was sort of hesitant, considering that parents from international backgrounds could be a bit hesitant and scared for their sons and daughters to be joining an organization which could be, in some people's eyes, considered as a radical organization. How does Amnesty tackle that issue of reaching out to the people who are under restrictive environments?
Well, this is very much the reason why a lot of the focus of the campaigning is always to other countries. So if you come from a country where the government may come after you, obviously you have to be very, very careful. And so that's a very important reason why We don't, of course, Japan's Amnesty Office does get involved in the death penalty issue, but we think it's more effective if you have comments coming from other countries, pressure coming from other countries to tell Japan, face up to doing what you said you would do, as it was, in terms of protecting human rights. So that is one way that those people can be protected, if you like. Nobody has to put themselves in danger in order to protect other people.
Yeah, of course, I agree with you, Marian. And it has been said that if people are afraid of their government, that's totalitarianism. If the government is afraid of the people, that's democracy. And I prefer to live in a country where the government has to work hard to keep the people happy, rather than a country where people have to worry about what they do in order to avoid sanctions from the government. Having said that, I'm not labeling any countries, of course, but we do have the freedom to express our opinion. We do have the freedom to write. And as I said before, I think we should exercise those freedoms. If we don't, we might lose them. And this is not abstract. In the case of an international school, of course, you do want to avoid upsetting and alienating parents by naming their country as a human rights abuser. However, in some cases, the facts speak for themselves. And if, for example, you know someone is in prison who should not be in prison, you know someone is being denied the rights that they should have according to their country's laws and constitution, then I feel you have a perfect and inarguable right to do something about that, to protest about that. If a young person sees an injustice and wants to protest it, but they are nervous about maybe attracting a negative response towards their family or themselves, then they can use their school address when they write a letter. They don't need to use their personal address. There are many, many cases now where you can simply register as a user, as a member, to avoid multiple abuse of the system, should we say, to avoid people clicking on many, many cases several times over. But each national Amnesty International site now has many cases detailed where you can support a person or you can support a campaign simply by clicking on a box, rather like you just click on like on a social networking site. And those are without any risk of being identified personally. So there's a lot you can do even if you're nervous about your personal safety. And I'd ask people to, if they have any reservations, to contact Amnesty International Japan or to contact ITEN, and we can discuss in more detail what you can do in complete safety and without worrying that your parents might get angry about what you're doing. Individuals, of course, can get in touch with ITEN and to join the organization if you choose to. We'll help you certainly, and you can get more details from the Amnesty International Japan website. That's www.amnesty.co.jp. And most of the information there is in Japanese, but you can click on a tab for an English translation. Even more direct for English speakers would be to go straight to the ITEN website, www.iten.info, where most of the information is in English.
Sounds great. We'll definitely put the website and all the links on the video and in the description, so people can easily access. Is there any final thoughts you'd like to express before we end the episode?
And I will just repeat what I've already said. Human rights are like muscles. You should exercise them to keep them strong and make them stronger. If you don't use them, they might atrophy. So be confident that you live in a country where you do have freedom of speech, where you do have the freedom to get together with other people, either for religious reasons or political reasons. Use those freedoms. They're yours. Don't let them go.
Yes, use the freedoms that you have to help others whose freedoms have been taken away from them.